The first sin committed in the Bible is committed by God himself when he lies to Adam about the true nature of the forbidden fruit. Yeah, lying is a sin, remember? Look, God says, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die." That's a lie, right? That's not what happens. The snake, however, says, "You shall not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." That is the truth. That's what happens, which is also confirmed by God to be the truth after they eat the fruit when he says, "The man has now become as us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take from the tree of life and eat and live forever." It's also kind of confirmed by the fact that the tree is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, not the tree of immediate certain death, right? That's what it does. It gives you the knowledge of good and evil. I also find it interesting that the God in this story refers to itself as us, right? Plural, almost as if there's more than one, almost as if this all-knowing, beneficent, monotheistic father figure idea of God isn't the God that this story is referring to. Now, I'm sure a lot of people in the comments are upset with me because they believe I'm interpreting the story incorrectly because I'm not interpreting it from the perspective of their faith and their religion. But I would argue, just because you built a cult around an old story doesn't actually mean that the story itself belongs to you. The story is collective cultural human history. It belongs to everybody. These stories carry messages from the past, but the only way to learn new things from old things is to be intellectually open enough to look at them in new ways. And from that perspective, there is no correct way to interpret a story. Any interpretation that taught you something meaningful was a meaningful interpretation. The only objectively incorrect way to interpret something is to claim that there's only one correct way to interpret something. Now, this particular story, when looked at from outside the parameters of the dogmatic monotheistic worldview, starts taking on a lot of interesting parallels to a lot of other old stories. For instance, the Prometheus story from Greek mythology. Now, in this story, the Titan Prometheus falls in love with the humans. He thinks they're so great that he decides to sneak down when nobody's looking and give them the gift of fire. Gaining control of fire is a symbol for humanity graduating into something bigger, something more than just another one of the animals. When we control fire, we're no longer just at the whims of our environment. Now we can shape and control our environment to serve us. We can fight in new ways and build in new ways. We can keep the animals away and keep ourselves safe. We can cook our food, which means less work for our digestive system, which means more energy left over for other type of growth, like intellectual growth. Now, when Prometheus gives fire to the humans, it makes Zeus, the father figure god, absolutely furious. Why? Because it makes us too powerful. It makes human potential too great. It makes human beings too much like the gods. "The man has now become as us, knowing of good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take from the tree of life and eat and live forever." Also, there's nothing actually in this book, by the way. It's just an empty notebook. I memorized it. But isn't that interesting, right? If we cast the snake as Prometheus, the fruit becomes a symbol. Gaining the knowledge of good and evil is a graduation into awareness, into consciousness, becoming more than just an animal, blissfully unaware, free to live in a Garden of Eden. In fact, what's the first thing the humans do after they eat the fruit, right? They cover themselves up. They become self-conscious. They become self-aware. Obviously, in this version of the story, the God in the story is not the omnipotent, omnipresent, infallible, beneficent God figure that people have in mind. It's the Zeus kind of God, right? The king God, the personification of the concept of authority itself. And the story is about humanity outgrowing that authority, right? Becoming our own authority, but simultaneously inheriting the heavy, heavy burden of awareness that comes with that freedom and that power. Now, if you wanted to place the omnipotent, the omnipresent God in that story, it would be everything, right? That's what omnipresent means. It would be Adam, Eve, the snake, the apple, and the God character all at once. And the will of that God would be what happened, obviously, because that's what omnipotent means. The will of that God would be for humanity to graduate, to become more than just a beast, but also to understand that that means taking accountability for ourselves. And the knowledge of good and evil carries the understanding that the difference between good and evil is never as simple as simply submitting to authority. Now, I think this is an interesting interpretation. Do I think it's the correct interpretation? Obviously not, because I don't believe that there is one. But I will say that I'm quite glad that I'm not burdened by some ironclad ideological framework in my head telling me that there's something evil or sinful about considering an old story in a new way.